India's missing billions. Narendra Modi's government has given the Supreme Court names of people it accuses of holding undeclared foreign bank accounts. It's part of a wider campaign against corruption promised by Modi. But will that money ever be brought back to India? And is Modi's campaign politically motivated? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It's an issue that confronts governments and triggers public anger around the globe. The world's richest people hiding their money offshore and avoiding taxes at home. In India, where hundreds of millions of people live below the poverty line, it's a particularly explosive issue. India's richest people are said to hold billions of dollars in overseas tax havens. In June, the Indian government set up a special task force to find this so-called black money. And now it's given the Supreme Court a list containing the names of people accused of hiding their untaxed wealth abroad. We'll talk to our guests about whether that money can ever be retrieved in a moment. But first, Nidhi Dutt helps set up our discussion.
Consecutive governments in India have tried to tackle the issue of black money, which is essentially allegedly illegally acquired or untaxed cash that's parked in foreign bank accounts away from the view of the Indian system. Now, it's a huge challenge, one that many governments have failed to tackle adequately. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government came to office earlier this year, promising to deal with it fast, in fact, within its first 100 days in office. That deadline has since lapsed, and after being pressed by the country's Supreme Court, it's now submitted a list of over 600 accounts which it says may, and it's all possibilities at this stage, may have illegal cash stashed away. What we've got to remember here is where to from now. It's all well and good to have a list of hundreds of alleged illegal accounts with illegal money parked in them, but there's investigations to follow and there's prosecutions to follow, which are the really big challenge for the Indian government and the Indian judicial system, given the vested interests that may tumble out of the names and the accounts that are now with the Supreme Court. For Indians across the country, this is a hugely positive move when it comes to tackling corruption at the highest levels of Indian politics and business. But again, there's skepticism of how much the talk, the policies, and these moves in the right direction will actually translate into changes in the long term.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has promised to clamp down on corruption, describing it as a disease and a sin. As soon as he took office, Modi set up a special investigation team that would identify individuals hiding money abroad and repatriate their wealth. This isn't a new problem. Many of the names on the latest list were given to India by France some years back. Critics say because no action was taken, some of India's richest people may have taken the opportunity to hide their money elsewhere. And Modi has criticized the previous government for not doing enough. Well, let's now bring in our guests. In New Delhi, Sanjay Ejde, a lawyer at the Supreme Court of India. In Singapore, Surav Roy, Asian Affairs analyst. And also in New Delhi, Shaitan Sharma, a financial journalist and economic analyst. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Sanjay Ejde. It finally took a Supreme Court order for the government to hand over the full list of names. Why did it require this order?
The government did not really require this order. What was happening was that this has been an ongoing process with the Supreme Court from 2009 onwards. It was a judgment of the Supreme Court in 2001 which directed the setting up of a special investigating team. This team was finally put in place only by the new government, but then the new government was not very certain as to what it was required to do with all the data that it had. The data is very rudimentary. There are just about a few hundred names. Of those names, it is not certain which of these accounts actually hold illegal money. Indian tax laws are such that they tax only income from resident within India, from income derived in India. it is not illegal for an Indian citizen to have accounts in foreign banks as long as the central bank is informed about it. So it is a problem of having data, but then subjecting it to further investigation by India's tax authorities and also authorities charged with the compliance of foreign exchange and other laws.
Well, Shaitan Sharma, the government did release an initial list at the beginning of the week, some 7 or 8 names, but there again, it had to wait for the Supreme Court order for the full list to be released. I'm just interested in why there was this delay and why the full list was not handed over in the first place.
I think, it's a highly politically sensitive as well as, an economically sensitive issue. Let me first talk about the ramifications. What are we talking about? We're talking about 12 to 15 billion dollars at stake. Now this, if you look at it in terms of money, it translates to about a sixth of our budget deficit. It translates to about a 10% of the foreign flows that come into this country every year, and about a 5% of our reserves. Now, this much of money for a country that's going through a spiraling inflation, a burgeoning fiscal deficit, and a weakening rupee can be catastrophic. And just the return of this money can have huge ramifications on our economic system. On the political part, you see, we are a country where every 1 out of 3 poor citizens is an Indian of the world. Yet, if you look at the list of billionaires, we figure as number 6 in the world, which tells you the disparities of income and the extremities, a reflection of the world called corruption, on the plank of which the Modi government won the elections handsomely. The acquisition following several scams that took place in the prior government. So there's a moral obligation as well as a financial obligation of getting this money back, or at least finding out what the truth is. The government, of course, says that it's bound by the fact, as what Sanjay was saying, that they can only instigate an inquiry, only reveal names of those people against whom they have evidence to frame charges. Otherwise, the clause of confidentiality between the two countries gets flouted, and that's certainly not in the interest of the industrialist or the taxpayer. And that's really the dichotomy of the situation.
But,
so the Supreme Court, of course, holds... Yes.
So, apologies for interrupting you, Shaitan, but I just want to go to Saurav Roy with... Some of the cynics claim that the Modi government actually wanted to be seen to be instructed to hand over the list of names rather than to do it freely, thus to avoid the charges of political manipulation of what is essentially a criminally financial matter. Is there any possibility that that is a correct interpretation?
I don't know if that would have been the case, but I definitely think that when the matter goes to the court and there are instructions that follow from the court, then the government is bound to take certain steps because those are the orders that they have to follow. But I would completely agree with what Mr. Shaitan Sharma was saying, and he's nailed it on the head, that this is a bane that has taken down the country. And the joke that went around a couple of years ago is, where is India's capital? And the answer was in Swiss banks. Now, coming from that, we're looking at a situation where there's an intent, there is a commitment to handle this situation in such a way that there is an outcome out of it. And I would say that half a loaf in hand is better than nothing at all. So I do think there is a concerted effort, and if something comes out of this, then it's going to be great for an economy like India, which really needs, bold and strong steps like this, which arbitrage transparency instead of arbitraging opacity.
Well, Sanjay Ejde, it does appear very clear that this does fit squarely into an anti-corruption campaign being launched by the new Prime Minister. Would you agree with that?
Well, there has always been an anti-corruption mood in India for the past 2 or 3 years. This ties in very well with that mood. It also ties in with painting the previous government, which had somebody of foreign origin at the controlling the government. There seemed to be a problem about Indian money going abroad. So this ties in perfectly with the mood in the country and with the belief in the country that a lot of India's money is stashed away in foreign banks. But economists do tend to disagree with that. They think that a lot of money which is untaxed is actually in India, and that money which is in foreign banks is but a small portion.
Well, if I just want to go to Sirav Roy on this particular point. Now, this money was moved a long period of time ago, according to the allegations. It is very difficult to find money that was moved that amount of time ago. It could have changed form. It could have changed what it was. It could, as was mentioned there by Sanjay, have moved back into India in various ways. How is it possible to actually establish the sums that were moved at the time that the allegation is that the transfers took place?
It's not at all possible to, draw any line or to say anything conclusively that the money that went out of India is spread in a certain part of the world or is spread across different pockets, or whether it'll come back at all. I think it's anybody's guess that the money might just have been moved from one part to the other. And for those who have been named in the list as well, they would have known at some point of time that sooner or later somebody is going to investigate, so might as well as take certain steps that save our back. And having said that, I think that the chances of this money to come back, whether that's legally possible or whether that's financially possible, is actually pretty remote, because there are so many taxation treaties, there are non-disclosure agreements, there are confidentialities in place. So whether the money comes back to India sooner or later is just something that people might just have to end up guessing. But having also said that, I think that those who stashed off this money outside of India are probably just a fraction of those who are holding money within India, as Sanjay just said right now. And the quantum of money that is lurking within India is probably bigger than what that has gone outside. So this might be a great start, and this might be a great deterrent for those who are holding money in any form, whether inside or outside of India. And so this might just be the start for people to realize that you can't get away scot-free doing this.
Well, Shaitan Sharma, your view on that, is this an example being made?
See, I agree in certain ways. Let me just add to what was said earlier. There is, of course, there's no doubt about the fact that a large part of the corruption money stays within this country. And evidence of that is found in the fact in the real estate prices. That's typically the place where unaccounted money goes. On an average, if you look at the real estate prices, about 60% of money in real estate is dealt with in this country still by unaccounted income. And the sudden fuel up of real estate prices over the last half a decade is evidence to that. So there is sufficient merit in the argument that a lot of the money stays out here. Secondly, there is a lot of factual evidence to suggest that a lot of the money that goes out of this country comes back through foreign investments, through P-notes, and these issues were also being investigated. So one can really assume that a lot of the money, that even if it went out, has come back in some or the other form back into this country. But that doesn't do away with the moral obligation of getting whatever's left outside, unaccounted and illegal, from coming back. I think that is the core issue. If you rewind back to 1997, there was a very interesting scheme that was brought out by the government then, which is also the BJP government, which was called the VDIS, the Voluntary Disclosure Scheme, whereby they had got out a chart blanket and told, allowed people to bring in money into the country without disclosing the source of that money, as long as it was taxed at the prevalent rate of interest. And it was very successful. You had a couple of $1 billion coming in. You had about 3.5 lakh people actually coming in and being a part of that scheme. So that's what tells you that the magnitude of the monies that were lying outside. So perhaps it's time that something like that once again or some creative mechanism like that is put into place to bring this money back. That will really tell you how much of money there is, if nothing else.
Well, Sanjay Ejde, the Special Investigation Team, what kind of powers does it have? Are the powers wide enough, for example, to expand the investigation beyond these specific names into the amounts of money that may or may not have filtered back into the country? How wide are the powers of investigation of the team itself?
The investigating team has been set up under a judgment of the Supreme Court. If a team feels that it lacks powers, it can always come back to the Supreme Court and ask for specific powers. I don't think that there is any particular lack of power which is holding back the special investigation team. It is headed by a retired judge of the Supreme Court, but he would have to be financially instructed by tax officials, enforcement directorate officials, and everybody would have to work under his orders. Right now, these disclosed accounts may be part of the beginning that they could provide a target, a trophy target, as it were. If you could get the money which is still lying in those accounts and subject them to taxation in India, that would send a very salutary message. But the task as a whole would not necessarily have to be confined only to the special investigating team. There would have to be legislation to step in. You would also have to have the government to probably coming out with an amnesty scheme like my co-panelists suggested. There are two aspects of the problem. How do you deal with past transactions, and how do you ensure that these kind of things don't recur in the future?
Well, Surav Roy, this appears to be the important point, that this is not just an isolated affair, no matter the sums involved. This is actually something larger that is intent not only on going to what has happened, but also to prevent it happening again. Is that a correct interpretation?
I think that's a great interpretation, and it's got a larger picture as well, Mike. If you look at it, we are at the turn of the 21st century where Asia is churning wealth like nobody else anywhere in the world. And we've got two big economic powers like China and India generating wealth in a crazy and a disproportionate manner. And we're talking about two leaders, both in China and in India, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, cracking down on corruption and cracking down on money laundering. And I think the bigger picture is that both these leaders realize that for the Asian bloc to be a successful entity, they've got to move respectively away from the legacy of Wen Jiabao and Jiang Zemin, and as well as from the legacy of the Gandhi dynasty or of the previous Indian governments. And so having said that, I think that the bigger picture for both these two leaders, as well as for India solitarily, is that you've got to deal with what has happened in the past and how do you prevent it happening in the future. And if you contain that, and if you're able to stop that, then I would imagine that the spillover effect is that 1 billion people in India, and probably an equal amount in China, who are still living under the poverty line and have no access to basic amenities like healthcare, water, food, sanitation, and education, would probably see an inclusive growth and would probably see development actually touching their lives.
Shaitan Sharma, I mean, your view of putting it on a regional basis as well, looking at this as part of a pattern that is happening within the wider region as a whole and not just India.
Oh, absolutely. And I completely agree with what was said earlier, because, you know, this is a classic case of developing economies. Of course, I'd say that China doesn't fall under the category of that, but the disparities of income, given, you know, the vast populi, and the way the disparities have panned out over several centuries demand an equitable distribution of wealth now. India, of course, has had its own legacy of trying to do that through subsidies, something which actually, unfortunately, has been counterproductive and has fueled corruption over the years. In fact, there was a very interesting saying by one of our former prime ministers who said that, you know, every 1 rupee of grant that's given out by the government, only 16 paise, which means about 1/6 of that actually reaches the end user, which means 85% goes into, well, corruption, so as to speak. So that's the magnitude of the problem that we are confronting. And of course, we know that all money that lies in the corruption fraternity is actually, in some ways, fueling inflation, because that money is inefficient, and that's in the hands of a few. So if you look at a holistic situation of a country like India, which is right now confronting perhaps its worst case of inflation, and it's on the brink of you know, what everybody hopes will be a golden period, one of a double-digit growth. And to enable that, you've got to have, to say but the least, at least transparency in your system. And that's something we've seen over, in fact, the last 4 months, the kind of schemes that have been brought out by the Modi government. It all suggests that there is a will. Also, Mike, this is perhaps the best time that India can have its fight against corruption. Apart from the fact that this government won its votes on that, it was this very political party which started or initiated, its voice against black money, as well as the fact, if you look at the history of what has gone by in this country over the last, let's say, about 36 months, you've seen sitting ministers being incriminated and going behind bars, something that never happened over the last 5.5 decades. So that shows that there is a will, a political will to see that those who faulted are brought to the book. In fact, they really want to bite the bullet now, and this is perhaps the best time, as what was said earlier.
Well, Sanjay, today, this whole issue of cleaning out society, corruption is seen by the outside, many on the outside, as having been endemic in India. The Modi government now appears to be sweeping this away, but also being very, very anxious to make clear what it is doing, make that transparent, not just for Indians, but for the rest of the world as well. Would you agree?
Well, India has recently been declared standing around 150 in the ease of doing business. There's a economic cost to corruption, because if the wheels have to be greased everywhere with cash, then the ease of business keeps going down. So this is part of making India more business friendly, making India much more transparent, and seeing to it that this money, which is corrupt, which is out offshore, does not influence Indian polity, Indian decision making in any manner. Ultimately, whatever money which is stashed abroad, if it is put to much better use in India, if it gets an economic return in India, there will be no incentive for it to stay abroad.
Well, let me go very quickly to Surav Roy on an issue that you brought up there. The Ease of Doing Business report, India's ranked 142 out of 189, this drawn up by the World Bank, which hastens to point out that this does not take into account the actions under the Modi government, and has expressed the hope that India will rise sharply in this rating in coming months, should the example of what we've seen in the first few months be carried through. Your reaction to that?
You know, Mike, the Indian Tourism Board advertises all around the world with hoardings saying "Incredible India." And I think if that happens truly in India, that's truly incredible. But I'd like to also bring a point of comparative here between what Chetan said earlier, and that is, you know, in China, when there is corruption, there is a very strict, heavy-handed dealing with that. In India, corruption generally ends up with a cover-up, somebody or the other covering it up. And I think that's the mentality that needs to change. That's also the kind of governance that needs to change. One needs to tackle it right at its source, and one needs to catch the bull by the horns, without which I think it's just a lot of talk in air, and we'll just be looking at the same situation 10 years down the line as well.
Chetan Sharma, very quickly, your comment on that.
I think, you've got to understand where the problem lies. Now, of course, one part of the problem, you've got to understand that black money can be bifurcated into two areas. One is that money that was stashed away to evade tax, and the other was money that was concealed via corruption. They're two different kind of situations, right? Now, if you look at the first situation, where it is purely to evade taxes, you've got two areas out there where you can control. One is, of course, you've got to have a more tax-friendly climate, which means you have to have a more inclusive system. You have to have more people paying lesser tax, so to be able to address your fiscal deficit, as opposed to having very high rates of tax and then having fewer people pay them and the rest evading them. So you've got to have tax-friendly measures to address that issue. The second thing is, of course, it was said, is that you've got to have legal reforms in place. Which means that if you're booked and you're found guilty, action is taken as soon as possible. Logically, what happens is that you get away with the fact that you can defer your problems in courts. You can buy time, and by the time really a decision is taken, well, the cost of money itself is become paltry. So people actually find, well, it's not a bad idea, even if you're booked. the cost of interest, at least, the time cost of money is saved. So you've got to get legal reforms in place, and you've got to have a more tax-friendly climate to be able to address the issue in a twin objective.
Well, at that particular point, my thanks to our guests, Sanjay Hegde, Saurav Roy and Shaitan Sharma. And do please add your thoughts to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter at AJ Inside Story is where to find us. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching. From me and all the team, goodbye for now.